Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 25th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive in, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. And if you would like to support the show on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Will Dufresne, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so much. So let's dive right into it. This week I had the opportunity to speak with the author of Good Daughtering, the work you've always done, the credit you've never gotten, and how to finally feel like enough, Dr. Allison M. Alford. Allison is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Information Systems and Business Analytics at Baylor University. Her PhD is in communication studies. We're going to talk about what exactly that means. And she also has her own coaching and consulting firm, Good Talk Communication Consulting, where she offers communication coaching to help professionals and students, really learn how to improve their communication skills. Her research focuses on all sorts of very interesting topics like adult daughtering, work-family balance, and invisible labor. So we're going to get into it today without any further ado. Here she is, Dr. Allison M. Alford. Well, Allison, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Great to be here, Cara. Thank you.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, Good Daughtering, the work you've always done, the credit you've never gotten, and how to finally feel like enough. I think that almost any woman or even any, gender minority who is listening to this show can really resonate just with the title alone. But before we get into sort of the topics of the book, let's talk a little about you and your subject matter expertise. So your training is in communications, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I've always been kind of confused about it's funny, I was all through psychology. I remember the communications and the psychology department shared a building at my undergrad alma mater, and I was always like, "What do they do over there?"
Right. It can be very siloed when you're in a university setting, but I mean they're companions. I think of communication studies and psychology as cousins. And psychology is a study of what are we thinking? What is our cognitive processing? What is our assessment of that? And communication is the study of how do we co-create our realities through a shared experience,
Mm,
through talking or body language, or how do I get my point across to someone, whether it's through language or nonverbals. And as a researcher, I'm interested in how the language we use or the choices that we make with our physical self create our reality. So, in some schools, you'll find them in the same spot. In some schools, you'll find them in different places. I would say also a distinction, to just be very bougie about it,
mhm.
is we think of communication, no S, as the study, the field of shared realities and how communication shapes our lives. Whereas communications with an S is more like media studies. Very important,
Mhm.
but a little bit more of a distinction there. Journalism is communications. Um, so I don't know if that helps a little bit.
I think that helps a lot, and it makes me almost, I feel a little cheated that as I did my undergrad also, I was in Texas, back at the University of North Texas and my master's there, and then did a whole career actually as a journalist, and then I went back to school to finish my PhD somewhat more recently, and so as a working clinical health psychologist, I feel cheated that I didn't get communication like, not communications training, but communication education and training, because I feel like it would really improve or increase one's capacity in a clinical setting to have a deeper understanding of the very things that you
Mhm.
study.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very theory driven and it's very much based on the idea of like what does our social system create between us and how do we interpret that and how do those interpretations then transform our lived experiences, our realities, and our relationship. And so a lot of course, communication studies is about what's broken,
Mm. Mhm.
what's not going well in relationships. Why do people divorce? Or why are there on again, off again relationships or stalking or something? But there's also a lot of exploration of what makes relationships work. And that could be in a personal setting, family setting, interpersonal, one to one, or it could be in an organizational setting. Like, how do we like our boss?
Mhm.
And also in the school I was in, UT Austin, that had a rhetoric program. So also, how does our written communication, such as public speeches, public address, uh, change people's experience of a candidate or a person or a phenomenon? So I think it's a bit cerebral, and what's really important is to bring it to get to that place, but then always bring it back to the real people who need to use it. And for me, that's why I wanted to bring out a book, because I thought in academia, you create these publications, they take you 2 3 years, they cost money to get grants and get people to take do the surveys, and then like 20 people read them. And
Mm.
I've always wanted to have an impact, to have real people use this information to have better relationships and better lives.
It's so interesting when we think about kind of interpersonal relationships, and especially at the familial level. Mothers and daughters is a perfect example, and then we think about interpersonal relationships in organizational structures, employees and bosses, coworkers, teams. They feel like they'd be very disparate areas of inquiry, but at least from a psychological perspective, they are, I consider them two of the three sort of main pillars of mental health and self-efficacy. You've got love, you've got work, and I often say, and then you've got play. And so two of those three are these familial or even, as you mentioned before, um, I guess, romantic, relationship structures, just relationship structures in general, and then the interpersonal experiences people have at work, which of course includes their educational endeavors and, kind of associated things. It's most of us are not operating in a vacuum. We're working with people, we're living with people, we're interacting with people all the time. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious how you chose or how you choose, where to kind of point your research, because it's pretty broad, the options that are available to somebody who works in this field.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that context matters. There's nothing that happens in a vacuum. And so when we think of our own relationship with our parent, it really matters what our socioeconomic status is, what country of origin we're from, what privileges we have, or what difficulties we've experienced, what illnesses have come into play. So context always matters when we are examining how and why this relationship is going in this way. So for me, I think one thing that's kind of opaque for some people is, what do you do during a PhD? And I
Mhm,
I learned that a large part of doing a PhD is reading and learning and listening so that you can understand the scope of the field and
mhm.
what's happening. And then the next thing that you have to do is think, what have we not explored yet? And why? Why wouldn't we have explored that thing? And what I learned was that we had some information about women in midlife, particularly around parenting or in the workplace, or we had information about adolescence and the parent child relationship. And we had information about research already done, great research, important research about how women are the primary caregiver for their adult parent, typically in elderhood. But we were just missing so much nuance and context from the middle of life, from what you're
Mhm.
doing in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, when you're two independent or interdependent individuals, and and nobody's sick or hurt or kind of needing the other, but you're trying to be in a relationship, which means you're connected, you're interconnected, and you do want something from each other. And so I directed my attention towards that, towards the idea of what is the active role of daughters and daughtering, because I saw that there was a gap. There was not a usage of this sort of agentic agency given format for thinking of how women show up in families. And we
Yeah.
have had a lot of progress over many decades about how we think of women as active participants in their home, in their work life, in their social systems. But we really weren't thinking, it wasn't being discussed intergenerationally in anything except the sort of more rare contexts. And that's why I thought, there's a bit of hubris because it was about myself as well, but it's like in my family, I do a lot. I mean, I am
Mhm.
giving a lot, I am asking a lot, I'm coordinating, I am showing up for these people because they matter to me, but I'm not just some waif who's just blowing in the wind waiting around for mothering. I am doing daughtering actively, and when I look at my peers, the smart women around me, they are too. But for some
Mhm.
reason nobody's giving any credit to how much that draws on our resources or drains our resources and means we have to make trade-offs with other things in our lives.
I think part of the reason when this book came across my desk that I immediately was like, "Okay, I wanna have this conversation," is because it resonates even beyond this, I guess, this relational role of daughtering. The first thought that comes to mind when I read literally the title of your book was, emotional and cognitive labor. It's like the only thing I could think of, and I got to admit, this is a hot topic of conversation among my friends, within my relationship, even in the therapy sessions that I have with my patients, a lot of sort of psychoeducation about gender roles and about expectations and about the way that we raise our girls versus boys and how that translates to the roles and the responsibilities that we assume as we grow into adult women versus adult men. And I can't help but point to, and I've mentioned this on the show before, and I'm just curious if you've seen these documentaries and if you feel like I don't know if you feel like the same kind of connection to them as I do. But Jennifer Siebel Newsom has produced some really phenomenal documentaries in the past. Her first one was Misrepresentation. She then did The Mask You Live In, and then finally, another one that really resonates for me is one called Fair Play, and they really grapple with this gendered expectation that is societally induced and that is sort of invisible under the radar. We all carry it, and sometimes we don't even know we're carrying it.
Well, you nailed it. You nailed the entire premise of my book and my research, which is the idea of invisible labor and why that expectation exists. But, Eve Rodsky is the author of a book called Fair Play that then
Mhm, yeah.
became a card
It's
game
based on
as well
that. Yeah,
as
yeah.
a Netflix special, and she was kind enough to give, support to my book because ultimately that is what we're talking about. We're talking about
Mhm.
invisible labor, we're talking about social expectations, and how the social context matters in how we show up or decide how much to show up. And yet we haven't, most of us, decided. We're just doing something, out of rote sort of
Yeah,
discipline or
yeah.
obligation. And that's sort of my call to action, right? Is that you get to decide. Daughtering is active and it is a choice. You may not have noticed before that it was a choice, that you had a choice, that you were doing things on your own because very often we have the idea of daughtering pushed to the back. When we think of women and women's labor, we tend to think with a maternal lens. We
Yeah.
tend to say things like, I'm mothering everyone around me, or even there's a lot of trending videos where someone says, I'm raising my parents now, I'm mothering my mother.
Mhm.
And so what that revealed to me as part of my research was we lack a lot of the language that we need to get to the nuance of what it means. Because there's no way that I'm actually raising my mom. She's not 9.
Yeah.
And I've had a 9-year-old, and it's a very different power dynamic. But there is a caring role, there's an obligation role, there is a closeness factor, there's an intimacy concern. But because we are not adept at using those types of vocabulary, we default to this bigger idea that all types of caring behaviors are maternal. And really, it's a patriarchal lens of the maternal body, that women's bodies are maternal in
Oh,
everything we
yeah.
do. And
Agree
it's
a
it's
hundred
an unfair
percent. It's like on us.
representation.
Right? It's like
Yes.
the structure itself of the patriarchy maintains and perpetuates that type of expectation, that type of I don't maybe burden is too strong a word, maybe it's not. And and I struggle with it too because I'm not a mother, and I think in some ways that affords me a certain level of freedom where I don't always identify with those types of, ideas, and I don't always identify with the language. I tend not to use it as often. But I even in my own relationships, I found myself saying, "I'm not your mommy therapist. That is not my job." You know? That is not my
Yeah.
role, and that's not the role I intend to assume in this relationship. But you're right, I don't often think of daughtering as active, and possibly it's because for the majority of the time that was formative when we considered ourselves the most daughtery, if I could put that in air quotes, we didn't have a choice. We didn't have agency when we were young, or at least not that much agency.
Yeah, you're right, you're right. So we're talking about when you're a child, when you are a
Mhm.
minor, you lack the ability to decide. Not only are you not cognitively able, but you're completely dependent on these parents for money, for safety, for legal authority. And that's totally different when you have an adult who you then begin to give care to, who's older than you, who has legal authority, money, power,
Mhm.
and agency. And so that's why the same words don't work. And I actually think that it's easiest to see that dichotomy within the women who don't have children,
Mhm.
because because a woman who doesn't have children doesn't claim to mother everyone everywhere all the time. Then it starts to be like, of course it doesn't make sense that all of a sudden she would mother her mother.
Right.
Instead, the more honorable way to address our full humanity, the complexity of women's bodies and lives and experiences, is to say, let me use representative language for what it means to do daughtering. And
Mm.
let me bring that type of language to the forefront and describe the difficulties, the pain points, the benefits, the obligation, the beauty, and talk about it in its own right. And I think that women, we have fought over the last 100 years, right, especially in the US, so for the right to be seen as individuals in the workplace, not just women in the workplace, but just an individual in the workplace.
Yeah.
And this is kind of a next frontier, is to think of daughtering as a role that is important, and it is honorable, but it is distinctly different from mothering or being an individual or being a neighbor or being a friend or being a worker. It is an obligatory relationship with its own power dynamics and closeness issues and intimacy complexities that is between me and an elder generation. And when I start to think of it that way, it's like, yeah, I wanna be able to use words with nuance that describe the full scope of that experience. And we do see, and my research has shown, there's a wide variety of ways to do daughtering and types of mothers and fathers that you got and types of childhoods you got and adulthoods that you got. And we're not going to really be able to fully explore and understand each other's experiences unless we could talk about it with its own vocabulary.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about, as you just mentioned, every um, relationship and every kind of connection is unique. There are some themes, if you live in the United States, there are societal themes and pressures that everybody probably experiences. But then, as you mentioned before, based on different demographic factors and also just fundamental differences, like I do have brothers, but I didn't grow up with brothers. For example, I have one sister, so we were a daughter household, and we grew up with a single mother, as my parents were divorced. I know people who uh, don't have mothers or don't know their mothers, or they lost their mothers when they were very young. There are people where there are multiple children in the family. There are, of course, only children. All of these things, um, you know, make for a completely different experience. But all that being said, I caveat because I am curious about your take, going back to this concept of invisible labor, about how the daughter uh, role and the daughter responsibility translates into the invisible labor that women tend to carry throughout the lifespan, not just with their mothers, but also with their partners and also with their siblings and also with their colleagues and across the board. Do you think, does it all kind of come back to the expectations and the responsibilities that that's put on daughters and that daughters therefore assume?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and so the concept that we're talking about is invisible labor, and I think it's
Mhm.
a good point to define what is invisible
Sure.
labor. And invisible labor is unpaid work that uses your resources such as time, energy, money, your personal bandwidth, your battery life in
Mhm.
order to achieve a goal. And with daughtering, the goal is connection. The goal is that we are trying to stay in our family, stay connected, keep the group together. And so in order to do that, we expend our resources. And through my research, what I found was there's four different ways that we can think of labor within the daughtering work, and one of them is visible and three are invisible. And
Hmm.
so I talk about daughtering labor as acting, thinking, feeling, and being. And so
Okay.
when you're acting like a daughter, that's pretty visible. You took a casserole, you bought a gift, you showed up for the holiday, you helped paint a room or do some yard work. But and everybody could see that. Maybe you could even take a picture and put it on Instagram or Facebook,
Mhm.
right? So it's very visible. But then the thinking work, feeling work, and being work are invisible because they're happening inside someone's head, their
Right.
heart, their body. And so thinking work is the cognitive labor of planning, preventing issues, putting aside resources well in advance of the time they're needed. So the thinking work could be years or even decades in advance of when the thing that you need is going to happen.
Mhm.
I met with one woman who told me she was creating a fund for when she was an only child, an only daughter, and she felt like when her parents in the future, decades in the future, would become ill, that was going to be a big financial burden. So, in order to alleviate her current feelings of stress, she started putting money in a bank account and she
Yeah.
talked to her partner about it and they budgeted for it. And so that was both cognitive and emotional. So the feeling work is the emotion work of emotion work is soothing and smoothing and making everyone feel comfortable and putting out fires, preventing problems before we ever get to the problem, like telling your brother, okay, You know that thing that you always do and it makes mom mad and then she leaves the room? Don't do that. Just don't do that this weekend, okay?
Yeah,
That's
and
kind of an
also, I think it's
emotional soothing.
for sure, and I think even beyond that, and obviously this extends outside of the daughter role into a lot of the female roles that we assume in our lives, but anticipating the needs of men, really
Mhm.
anticipating the needs of anyone who is around us, but very often anticipating the needs of men and sort of how do I put this? Anticipating the emotional reaction of men so as to ensure everybody's comfort. I think that this is a
Absolutely.
massive emotional
Massive.
and cognitive labor that we undertake daily and don't realize how exhausting it is.
Yeah, for sure. There's one form of being emotionally responsive, reactive empathy, and that would be as if you're the thermometer in the room, right?
Mhm.
Taking the
Mhm.
temperature. But the harder labor, the daughtering labor, the woman's work is to be the thermostat, which is to
Mhm.
say, this is the temperature we're going to be, and I'm going to make everybody come to this temperature. And of course, you would leave the dinner or the event or the group chat or whatever exhausted
Yeah.
because, we all know the thermostat is using power and working hard to try to regulate that environment. And so these are the kinds of things that are the reason that they're invisible is they're not tangible. Many of these things are preventative. We can't take a picture of them and put it on Instagram and say, I thought about 30 years in the future when my dad might need care and put $100 in the bank account. I guess in theory we could, but typically we don't. So it's
Mhm.
invisible. And the last one of the types of invisible labor that I talk about is being work, which is identity work of how am I a daughter representing
Mhm.
my family, the legacy, the traditions, and being a good daughter, the daughter that they would want me to be, or the family member or the person that they raised me to be. And those are not necessarily happening face to face, engaged in talking with your parent. They're happening inside the daughter. So, unless the daughter reveals them, narrates them, tells someone else about it, they are they're difficult to see, and that's what makes them invisible.
Yeah, and there are some real, I think, negative psychological consequences from engaging in sort of ongoing invisible labor that we all do engage in. I mean, I think one of them is this feeling of like this is so thankless and I never get any credit for it, and that can be a hard feeling when somebody is working really hard under the radar and all of their sort of hard work just goes unnoticed or there's not a lot of gratitude in the room. But I think there's even a more pernicious problem where by the very virtue of this type of labor being invisible, it reinforces the privilege that those who aren't doing the invisible labor have to not do it. And so when I think about the idea of anticipating the needs and being the thermostat in the room, it allows for individuals who are not taking on that role to be reactionary, to not regulate their emotions, to do none of the labor and actually not. It's like by definition, it's a negative feedback loop. Right? Like the more that somebody else takes on that role, the more that the people who don't even know it's happening don't have to take on that role.
Absolutely. It's a reifying experience. So once it
Mhm.
happens and then it happens again and then happens again and I think that many women, particularly recently in the trending topics, we've heard of the eldest daughter syndrome. I think
Mhm.
this speaks really well to that point, which is the eldest daughter, whether in childhood or continuing through adolescence into adulthood, she gets really good at managing, preventing, caring for, stoking, tending, minding, whatever the sort of caregiving types of words we can use. Well, then, even if there are other daughters or sisters, they are not as able. And it's because she keeps doing it. And then every
Mhm.
time she thinks, the eldest daughter thinks, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to be the one who fills the stocking, brings mom's favorite cake, fixes things in the group chat. Well, then what happens is nobody else does it.
Yes, and
And it's
everything falls
because
apart. Yeah.
right, because they don't know how, and the eldest daughter doesn't know how to resist for long enough for those other people to learn. So then it
Right.
just is like, "Ugh, I guess this is my role. These people will never do this, and so it's gotta be me." And then
Mhm.
she's back at it, and so whether it's a son or a younger sibling, the situation is reified, it's reaffirmed, it's reinstated, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? And I think the
Mhm.
hopeful message that I want to impart is actually many, many things are changeable, and you are not trapped in a system that is immovable, immobile, static. You are a change maker and you can make that change as long as you can be patient enough to know that people don't change quickly. And these types of changes that we might want in our family system, they can take a long time, like putting on a pair of braces. Our teeth are not going to change overnight. They're going to take 2 or 3 years of daily movement and monthly appointments for them to finally become a beautiful smile. Well, similarly, your family is not going to change because you make one quick change. It takes a long time, but if you can be thoughtful and patient, you can make positive changes that are both good for the family and good for the self.
Yeah, and it seems like another really important ingredient other than patience is boundaries. Is the
Yes.
ability to say, "I'm not gonna do that thing, and I'm going to, do what I can to empower others to take that role." Maybe it's about delegating, maybe it's about just, being more pointed in how we ask for help, but also removing myself from the situation if and when there is a lot of emotional dysregulation, or if and when chaos ensues because I didn't clean everything up. I have to allow myself the freedom to disconnect from that uncomfortable display and say, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. We're going to get past
Yeah.
this. And I'm
Yeah.
not going to bear witness to this drama right now.
Well, one of the ways that I'd like to talk about that, and I talk about this in
Hmm.
my book, Good Daughtering, is there's different kinds of happiness. There's different ways to think about good relationships and a good life. And so Seligman, who's a positive psychology
Hmm.
person, says in his book, he talks about eudaimonic happiness and hedonic happiness. And so eudaimonic happiness is overall big, overarching lifetime happiness. What makes us feel like a good person who's lived a good life? And
Hmm.
hedonic happiness is what makes me happy right this moment, today, and feels really good and fun.
Hmm.
And you can kind of see that there'd be problems with each of those. There's benefits to each of them, there's problems to each of them. And I think, metaphorically, I think of this like a homeowner. I'm a homeowner or a home mortgager from the bank, and, what that brings with it is a lot of satisfaction about living in a home, providing a home for my children, being a neighbor, being in a community. But what it also brings with it is I have to take the trash out or it smells in the kitchen. I have to deal with a fallen tree limb or it will break a window. I have to pay for cockroaches to be eliminated or they'll crawl across my bed. And so there's a
Hmm.
lot of junky stuff, not fun stuff. So it's not pleasant every single day to be a homeowner, but it contributes to my eudaimonic happiness, my overall lifelong big picture happiness to say, I did that. And sometimes I also need to contribute to my daily happiness and say, not today, trash bag. Not today, gutters with the leaves in it. I'm gonna put out a decoration in the front yard and enjoy this little flag or something. And we have to balance those things. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that if we evaluate our lives as daughters or as women or as individuals in the same way, we can notice that sometimes you have to do junky, not pleasant stuff and yet it still contributes in a way to an overall long-term satisfaction and happiness
Yeah.
with a life well lived. And I think there are many parts of daughtering that are kind of unpleasant in the moment, but overall I feel like, yeah, I'm a good person and this is good daughtering, and this is a I'm happy to have provided this to my parent.
For sure. And I think some of those examples are also just really an algorithmic, like ROI calculation. I have a very good friend who has a lot of executive dysfunction, right? So she really struggles with ADHD. And one of the things, a perfect example was that historically, when she had her last dog, she had one of those gravity water feeders for the dog, and the dog was constantly running out of water, and then she would just pour water into the bowl. And I was like, "Why don't you fill up the bottle part?" Because if you do that, you don't have to pour water into the bowl every few hours. It's just like, it's so much work. What are you talking about? You're doing so much more work now than you would if you would just take the few extra seconds to fill up the bottle feeder first. And I see this happen all the time, where there's a quick fix or a quick interjection because it feels less taxing. But really investing a little bit more effort now pays dividends in the future. And I think that that kind of goes hand in hand in what you're talking about affecting change. Part of it is
Yeah.
patience, part of it is boundaries, and part of it is, kind of flexing your chief executive a little bit and making decisions now that hopefully will pay dividends in the future.
Yeah, and if I was to talk to your friend, I would say, what is it within you that feels like that job of filling up the bowl is too big? And so I think there's a bigger conversation, which is,
Yeah.
where are all of our resources being taxed? Where are all of our resources being expended? And who can we bring in to help us
Mhm.
with the big picture items? And so in my life, doing daughtering, I think many women think of daughtering or the mother-daughter relationship or parent-child relationship, if it's with their dad or stepdad, stepmom, mother-in-law, whatever, as this really one-on-one isolated thing. And I think of it as a group effort. And so when I'm thinking about going to see my mom and dad, and I'm going to go to their house, and I'm going to spend a weekend, and I'm going to spend money and buy food for us, etc., I enlist my support system to all have tasks, and those tasks are not them doing grandchilding or them doing son-in-lawing, if you will.
Mhm.
Their tasks are to help me do effective daughtering. And I think sometimes we forget that we can go one step bigger and ask the question, "Why am I so worn out that I can't fill up the bowl? Who do I need
Mhm.
to ask for help in my life, in other spaces, at work, in my community, in my extended family, in my, with my partner?" And then I may free up, because resources are finite. And so if I'm using them
Absolutely.
all at work, or I'm using them to do the dishes, or I'm using them on childcare, or I'm using them to get out the vote, I'm going to have fewer resources for daughtering. But if
Yeah.
daughtering becomes an important thing to put my attention on, then I need to figure out how to draw resources and support toward that activity to support me, so then I can feel good about it, like I'm doing it in a measured way, in a balanced way.
And I think there's almost an unstated major premise here that we touched on, but maybe glossed over quickly, because I can imagine, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the listeners now, and I can imagine that there are a fair amount of men listening to the show right now saying, "But I mean, why do you keep saying daughtering? Like, why is this not just apply to every child? Like, I'm a son and I have to do this and that, and I have to show up and do this. And why is it that the daughters are the ones complaining about being so exhausted?" And I guess what I would say to them, and I'm curious your take on this, is that when I go into the infusion center at the hospital where I work, 'cause I'm a psychologist, as I mentioned, in a cancer center, and when I enter into that infusion center, I'll tell you what, there are a lot of women and there are a lot of men who get cancer. It doesn't discriminate. And very often, the women who are there getting infusions are either there alone or their daughters are there with them. The men who are there getting infusions very often have their partners, their female partners, or their daughters with them. And I could bet money that if I surveyed the people there and asked them who made this appointment for you, it would be their wives or their daughters.
Yeah. That's a that's an astute observation, and I think research backs that up, that when,
Mhm.
individuals are ill or elderly, that the daughters take over, and it's by and large the
Mhm.
daughters, but it's also it's complicated as a little bit more by who lives closest, and then lastly, socioeconomically, who has the time to give.
Right, and
So, there
also
are some
who's single and who's not, because I do see sons
yeah.
step up, but I very often see the sons' wives stepping up. It's not
Yes,
even
and
their
so
parent, it's their
we
I mean,
have a
yes, it is,
lot
it's their
of
parent-in-law, but yeah.
yes, yeah, and so we have a lot of social systems at play there, because we can also
Mhm.
say, does that daughter-in-law have a full-time job, or is she doing this because she's quote unquote the stay-at-home parent? So then as that she then quote unquote has time.
Right,
But
and is
I
she
think
expected to? Exactly.
yes, and
Yeah.
so an interesting thing, I'll tell you a little story. My book came out in February, and it was on Good Morning America, and that was so cool. The hosts were sitting on the couch, and they were talking about the book and invisible labor and what women are expected to do. And Michael Strahan, one of the co-hosts, he pipes up and says, "Hey, Sam and I are going to write a book about sunning. It'll be one
Mhm.
page." And
Yeah.
I started laughing just like you, and I said, "Nailed
Mhm.
it." Because
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
biggest difference between sons and daughters is expectation. It's
Yeah.
not that men can't do this. It's not that men don't have it in them to be caring. It's not that all men are uncaring, unfeeling. It has to do with societal expectations about who does the healthcare work, the
Mhm.
childcare work, the family work. And I think some of those are changing over time, but we're not anywhere close to equality. So I mean there are many men who show up well in their families, and I think I would say my husband has been a great example of that to me over the past 9 years, with his mother who is in an assisted living facility, and he has just, I mean, completely stepped up. He's the leader of that. He's the decider, and, what a relief it's been, because I have a full-time job and I can't do that.
Yeah.
But not every man has the, um, emotional maturity to do that. And where does that come from? It comes from a lifetime of experiences, expectations, requests from the women, from the mothers to the fathers to the sons. And so I think one of the things that we can do to be hopeful about this for the future is say, well, let's teach our sons differently. So,
Yes.
I have a son. He's 17. And I talk to him, and so he's watched his dad be an incredible caring person to his grandma, and B, he read my book, which is called
Mhm.
Good Daughtering, but a son, an 18-year-old read it. And I
Mhm.
said, it's not necessarily about you, but of course, it's all about you, because you have a mom, you have a sister, you may have a wife at some point. And so, as a member of society, men need to be aware of this expectation difference. I think sunning is very real and very important. It's just not my personal area of expertise, but that doesn't mean that it's unimportant, or doesn't need to be highlighted. And so I'd love to see men step into that space and
I
say, I want
agree.
to do this. I love this. I enjoy this. And that's what creates long term culture change.
And I think, I think it bears sort of highlighting here, and I'd be curious your take on this because uh yes, you are very, very lucky that you have an incredible partner who does step up and who is kind of pulling that kind of weight and doing a lot of that labor. I have a similar partner, and this is a conversation we have a lot. I don't know if it's because he's a unicorn. I think part of it is that he cares enough. and that he's a feminist man and he thinks about these things and they matter to him. But I think part of it is because I wouldn't allow him not to. I wouldn't be in a relationship with somebody
Yeah.
who has those kinds of expectations of me. I refuse to fall into that trap, even though I still do it. We all still do it. And when we notice we're doing it, those of us who I think are doing the work to A, identify the problem of invisible labor, and B, try to affect change, are actually actively holding our partners to account. Like, I just won't do it. I just like, there'll be times
Yeah.
where I'm like, not my responsibility. So if it doesn't get done, I mean, I saw a TikTok video the other day. It was insane. It was this girl that was like, day 3 of not taking the package in from the front step and seeing what my husband does. And he would just step over the package and walk.
Yeah.
And then when he came home, he would step over the package and he would take the dog and he would step over. And I mean, maybe it was like to be funny and they planned it and blah, blah, blah. But it resonated for sure. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying before. It's not that men by their nature, it's not that men are incapable. It's that our society has afforded men the privilege to not even notice that they're not pulling their own weight when it comes to emotional and cognitive labor. It's
Yeah.
our sons, I don't have kids, but sons, brothers, whatever you wanna call
Yes.
them. Yeah, they
America's
don't.
sons.
Exactly, America's sons. They don't notice the amount of work that the daughters are doing because by definition, it's invisible, and until we make it visible and we bring it out into the open, and we hold our partners and, as you mentioned, our sons, when those of us who have them, um, raise them to be accountable, I don't think we're gonna see a lot of change.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's so important to recognize invisible labor can happen for anyone, any
Mhm.
gender, any sex, any person in any
Absolutely.
space. For instance, if somebody says, well, I've been managing our investment accounts for 15 years and you never asked about it, and I've been doing it and I've been trying to build this for us, that's invisible labor to the
Mhm,
person who had the privilege of not thinking about money
mhm.
in the relationship. And so it's not necessarily invisible labor itself isn't gendered, but there are what we can notice is many gendered responsibilities
Yeah.
and ideas about who does what and why. But when I look back at my own life, I think, it's not that one of us got a PhD, we got a PhD because getting that degree for me, learning the material, going home and saying, "This is what I read. This is what I learned." One of the things that happened, this is more than 10 years ago. I went home and I told my husband about this article that I read in a sociology class, and it's by Michaela D. Leonardo from the 80s, 1987. She writes about the article's called "The Invisible World of Cards and Letters." And it's about women's work, kin work, who invites the auntie who doesn't have anywhere to go and who makes sure she has a gift under the Christmas tree
Mhm.
at the event, that kind of thing. And it talks about sending Christmas cards. And I went home 10 years ago and I told him, sending Christmas cards is an invisible labor. And he laughed. Well, here we are 10 years on, and he sends the Christmas cards now.
Mhm.
And he
Yeah.
understands how hard that is now. And, um, and I don't think it's magic. I don't think it's luck. Like you said lucky. I actually
Mhm.
think it's learning. It
It
is,
is, yeah.
and so by virtue of myself getting a PhD and having a partner who just listened to me day to day, he was learning too. And, his investment in me getting the PhD was initially economic, like, let's get better jobs and better lives. But the side benefit is that he got open minded. He grew in his mindset of what is possible, what is true, what is normal, what is right. And so I think that should be a message of hope for any women who are maybe married to men that they're thinking, I'm not quote unquote lucky, or I'm not
Right.
married to the person, or I'm not finding that guy out there when I'm dating. And I want to be dating that person is, again, it's a braces mentality. It's a little bit at a time, over time, results in that beautiful smile. And as long as the person is willing to keep connecting with you and coming back to you, then change can be made. And the same is true for daughters with their parent, even when you think, this guy's 75, he's not going to change. My dad's not going to change. If you change, the relationship changes. It's not possible, based on communication theory, for the other person not to change. They
Yeah,
have
yeah,
to, they will, but it requires a lot of fortitude, a lot of patience, and a lot of willingness to sit in the tension of being in relationship with imperfect people. And if we can do that, and if we can notice that and say, this is worth it, not just between me and my parent, but heck, I'm shaping culture. I'm shaping future generations by just holding this line, this boundary, this, or talking about these things out loud. Then you can see that there's a greater human value in doing this work. And so that's why I want to encourage women to do the work, not give up or feel like it's fruitless or hopeless and just shut down and keep it to themselves. It
yeah.
matters and it's helpful.
And I think it's also okay to be angry. And it's also
Yeah.
okay to vent about it and to have moments where I think it is important too to give validity to the experience that so many women have, and I would say especially so many women of color have, where they're like, "Why is this my responsibility? Why do I have to keep doing all of this work?" Part of it is that this additional work that we're talking about helps relieve some of that burden, but I think it's a completely fair complaint. You shouldn't have to do it all. It shouldn't be a
Yeah.
responsibility, let's say, as a Black woman, to educate your white friends about the experiences that you have, just like it shouldn't be your responsibility as a woman to educate the men in your life about the invisible labor that you carry. It's an unfair position to be in, and yet the reality is it is the position that we're in because of these societal structures. We are in a
Yeah.
patriarchy. It's the water we swim in. We can't
Yes.
always see it, but it's
And yet
there.
it's also a dynamic system that is changing, whether
Yeah.
even though sometimes we feel hopeless about it.
Mm.
One of the chapters in my book is called Intersectional Perspectives on Daughtering. And I spoke to a few women of different races, different nationalities. I spoke to transgender individuals, and I asked them about their experiences because I think that those experiences, while they may feel like outliers to my own life, I'm a
Mhm.
white woman in Texas, they help us to understand the totality of the types of experiences that people are undergoing. And I think what's so interesting is to notice many of these ideas that we're wrestling with invisible labor are things that women brought up in the 70s and 80s. I mean,
Yeah.
the academics brought them up, but that's how long culture takes to shift from something being an academic idea to a pop culture idea.
Mhm.
And we can continue to be a part of that, right? So fourth wave feminism says it is the idea that if we engage in podcasts and online spaces and Facebook conversations and Substacks and social media posts about our experience, we are shaping culture. So I want to tell women your voice matters, even if you think, oh, I made a little video and 100 people watched it. And especially, anyone who interacts with future generations, those future generations are watching. And it really matters how they see you handling daughtering or daughter-in-lawing or stepdaughtering or the likes of those things. And when you place boundaries, they are empowered to place more boundaries on their time, their life, and their resources.
Absolutely. So I gotta ask here as we're ending the hour, you know, for those who pick up the book, and I hope it's not just daughters who pick up the book, because I think, as you mentioned before, sons have a lot to learn from the book. Mothers have a lot to learn. Fathers have a lot to learn. But for those who do pick up this book, what are you sort of hoping is is the main, or maybe a few different outcomes? Is it about just, validating somebody's experience first and foremost and being like, I hear you, trust me, this, you're not, crazy. Like this is an experience of many, many daughters. Is it about learning how to release I guess the reins a little bit, and allow, not even allow, but ask for the help that probably you so desperately need? Like, what do you hope the outcome will be here?
What I've heard from many women who have the book is there's a sense of relief. And that
Mm,
relief is both, I'm not alone. Wow, there are
mhm,
other women out there, and that story sounds just like mine. And so, even if I haven't heard that from a woman in my current circle of 5 to 10 or 15 women, there are millions of other people out there, and some of them are experiencing what I'm experiencing. But it's also a place that gives us language to get into the nuances, get into the thick of what does this mean? What are these aspects of my life, my daughterhood, being daughterly that perhaps I've never investigated before. So it's a space ripe for thinking work, for sitting in that space and thinking and evaluating who do I want to be as a daughter and what makes a good life. But the last part is, the book is not just full of definitions and research. It's got activities, and those activities are designed for you to do, whether it's what is my daughtering bandwidth, or what is my daughtering mission statement, or how to have a conversation with your sibling, with your parent. Because I think that the best the best way we can go forward with daughtering is to communicate it. What am I doing? What would I like? What looks good? How can we make this work together? And
mm.
so, while part of learning about this book is, hey, this is a pain point. Oh my gosh, I'm doing daughtering. This is hard work. The overall goal is to say, I can find greater connection and greater satisfaction and even better relationships, more authentic relationships with the people in my life when I'm able to express how important daughtering is and how much of my resources I'm using on it.
Gosh, I cannot thank you enough for sharing so many insights about a topic that is, absolutely ubiquitous and fundamental to so many people's experiences. But as you mentioned before, until it is kind of identified, until the introspection is there, until we have the language, it's just existing sort of under the radar and in the background. The book is Good Daughtering, the work you've always done, the credit you've never gotten, and how to finally feel like enough, by Dr. Allison M. Alford. Allison, thank you so much for being here with us today, for teaching us, and for bringing this into our consciousness.
Thank you, Kara. Really appreciate it.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.